It's World Goth Day, apparently, so what better day to examine a real classic game that shifted the entire landscape of role-playing games. Let me take you back to 1991. A young 15-year-old Grim is staring down the barrel of his GCSEs. Grunge is just sort of making its way onto the scene, and I would briefly be cool because I knew who Nirvana was about a fortnight before everyone else. The Gulf War is raging, the Soviet Union is collapsing, and in a desperate bid to be rid of him, Ed Sheeran's mother gives birth to him. Her gain, our loss. So that gives you some idea of what's going on. Now, we haven't actually heard anything about Vampire, and we'd mostly been playing Cyberpunk and similar games to that, so we were already on a kind of dark kick. The same sort of thing was happening across multiple forms of media at the time. Dark and gritty was in, so in comics, The Punisher was very popular, and a lot of heroes were taking that kind of darker bent. The Tim Burton Batman movie had just been a couple of years before, if I remember correctly, and yeah, everything was kind of taking that slant, in spite of the fact that in a lot of ways the world seemed a lot more optimistic than it had been. But Gen X, we were having none of it whatsoever. So, me and a friend of mine, John, we went on a special trip to Estevium Games in Aldershot, who were also a big distributor, still are as far as I know. And they had one of the biggest role-playing shops outside of London that we were aware of. So we went down there, looking for something new and something cool. I think on that same trip I picked up Blood, which I later ended up doing a second edition of and publishing, and Vampire. Now, this was basically pre-internet, you have to remember, and gaming magazines were relatively hard to get hold of, fairly thin on the ground. I'm not sure if it was Valkyrie or GMI or GM or one of its predecessors that was around, but I hadn't seen any reviews or anything of this, even then. So what was it about Vampire, first edition, that attracted me to it? Well, it was this cover. Simple, very simple, but graphically very striking compared to everything else that was around at the time. It was like it didn't have to boast or grab your attention in any other way, and it really stood out compared to other games. And I picked it up, and I flipped through it, and I decided that this was the one to get, along with a couple of other books that I got at the time. And I read it on the train trip back. I read this entire book in about 45 minutes to an hour, I guess. And then we sat down and we played our first ever session of Vampire immediately following that. So basically I played it essentially as soon as it came out in this country. And that set the tone for a lot of stuff that was going to happen since. This was a very, very influential game. I mean, not just in style, but in the way it kind of presented itself and in the way it wanted you to play it. Now, it's hard to explain to people brought up in this new era of indie games and so on, but everything about it, like so much of it was presented in character, something I would later find very, very annoying, because to get hold of information you had to wade through a mass of purple prose trying to find out actual facts. It was vague, so there was room for interpretation and so on, which is good up to a point, but again later would become annoying. It was a work of art, Tim Bradstreet's work. Some people don't like it because it's basically tracing photos, but it was really striking. It was a cut above a lot of other work that was out there, and it worked very well in the black and white. I mean, D&D had the famous artists of the time, and things like Dark Sun and so on later on, those would be very visually striking, but there was just something about the way that Vampire came together that was special. They renamed the Games Master or Dungeon Masters to Storyteller, which instilled a different kind of sense in the way you approached the game as someone who was going to run it. That sounds stupid, but language can make that kind of a difference. So you were approaching it not by building dungeons or anything else, but by telling a story. This, again, was something that I think would later become a drawback, because for a lot of people it became about the Games Master, the storyteller, telling their story rather than necessarily participating in a story with their players. So that would become something negative. The writing, the idea of what you were supposed to do in a game was very different, and it wasn't the system that was necessarily different. I mean, dice pools had been done, but the way it was presented was very different. That's what made the difference in the style and how people played, and this was either refreshing and new and great if you came from one particular point of view, or it was the beginning of the end of doom and pretension and, yes, social justice warriors in the gaming industry. It all really depends which angle you come at it as, but at least to start with, me and my group, we thought it was brilliant, and it came out at just the right time to tap into the whole goth revival thing that went on throughout the 90s. And it was so popular, so phenomenally popular, and so relatively cool compared to other role-playing games like D&D or whatever, that my tabletop group rapidly swelled to somewhere over 30 people, and we were essentially forced into doing LARPs, and they supported LARPs. There was some material in the main books to tell you how to do that, but then they brought out Mind's Eye Theatre, which was for salon style LARP play, which worked brilliantly for us, and I ended up joining the Camarilla and wasting years of my life on that, though I did meet my partner through the Camarilla and made plenty of lifelong friends, though a lot of people fall away as soon as you stop going to the LARPs, which tells you something, I guess. So the system wasn't that radical, but it was very graspable, and the fact that it used dice pools meant that you had a physical cue for how good you were at something. The more dice you grabbed, you could kind of feel and weigh the power in your hands, and when the Games Master reached for a handful of dice, you got a sense of dread. So that actually helped the storytelling emphasis, but so much of it was through the way it's presented, the way it's talked about, the advice that it gives. I think that's something that some people underestimate when they're writing a game, that how you can present it, the language you use, can influence how a game is played. I think a great, more modern example of that is Lamentations of the Flame Princess, which is, at its heart, basically just yet another old-school Renaissance clone of basic D&D. But due to the way it is presented, due to the way it's talked about, due to the way the examples are given in the text and so on, it's very weird, very gonzo, very horror-oriented. It has a very heavy metal aesthetic. And so that changes the way you approach the game and the material that you come up with for it. And Vampire was very much the same way, and rather than necessarily encouraging you to slaughter your way to the top in a way that previous experienced systems and other games had, Vampire sought to encourage and reward roleplay. So a proportion of your experience was awarded by role-playing well, presenting your character, playing your character well. So that encouraged players to really get into their characters, think about their backgrounds, think about how they would act and react, and put more effort into the presentation of the characters. Again, none of this was really anything new, but it just all came together and gelled in Vampire in a way that it really hadn't anywhere else. There were passages in Cyberpunk that were similar, and I think our transition from Cyberpunk to Vampire made sense as a progression. Cyberpunk talked about, you know, style over substance, and it had hints and tips about, you know, lighting and sound choices and stuff while you're playing, but that was only really a page or two, whereas in Vampire it was all over the place. And vampires are something instantly graspable, and this was really not the start, but the fuel injection turbo of the trend of horror games and dark games that came along later, though it was preceded by a couple of games, Nightlife for example, I think. It's just that the themes of it all were different. I mean, while you would eventually end up with the katana trench coat kind of stereotype and so on, that wasn't how it all started, and that's just, you know, fantasy wish fulfillment, and it was the style in films and comics and so on. So it was little wonder that it ended up that way. But then so did vampire fiction and films and all the rest of it. That's just how things went. I don't know if I'm doing a good enough job conveying how different this was at the time. I mean, and like I say, it tied into the goth revival, so you could be a role player and you could still be cool. that was a huge difference, and something I threw myself into wholeheartedly. Vampire introduced some other things that would really kind of shake up the role-playing world. Besides in-depth social and sort of mental mechanics, another presentation way that it was different was that it presented a meta plot. There was this idea, in what seemed like a long way off, I guess, the millennium, there was this idea that the end of the world might be coming, and that was incorporated into the game, with the idea of Gehenna there, the vampire apocalypse, the elders rising from below to consume their children. They've fucked it up in the end by bringing the old setting to an end rather than properly playing through it, but right up until that point there was this meta plot. So there was the story in the books, which might tie in with or go along with your stories, or it might not, but if you wanted to follow that story you had to buy all of the supplements, and that was very lucrative for a while, and a lot of other games did the same sort of thing, advancing the plot, advancing the story within their game world from book to book and edition to edition. Eventually people would get fatigued of doing this, especially when the published plots were nowhere near as good as your own, which happened quite often. But for a time there, that was the model. That was how you would make money. That was how you would encourage people to buy your books. And there were hints here about other books that were to come, you know, werewolves, mages, all the rest of it. But it existed in this weird space where they only ever kind of half acknowledged that these things took place in the same world. Crossover seemed to be kind of discouraged, and that went double for the LARP Society. In spite of this wonderful series of books that came out that expanded the world and allowed for other supernatural beings and creatures and so on, there was almost a kind of hostility, particularly from the vampire crowd, to the idea that these other things even existed or could impinge upon their section. The downside of all this, of course, was the pretension, was the emphasis on storytelling rather than story creating. The LARP Society became rather unhinged and full of itself, and in the end, of course, all the promise that was held in this idea of the story moving forward, of the end of the world coming, that was squandered when it came to the New World of Darkness and the way they handled the end. They screwed up Mage with the whole Avatar Storm. The end of the world and the vampire thing just kind of fizzled and was never really properly explored. But at the time, you know, seeing this game, its novel modes of presentation, the graspable, simple system that was easy to explain to new people, the easy transition into live action play, which, you know, was a good excuse to get dressed up, meet girls who had fun dressing up and playing as vampires. You know, this was all revolutionary and really good. And the emphasis upon role playing, that's maybe the biggest legacy. The idea of negotiating a story rather than a dungeon, of being rewarded for embodying your character, playing your character, doing things because they made for good drama or because your character would do them rather than because they'd let you win. You know, all of this just came together at this perfect time in history, and in this perfect form in this first book, and with this enticing, different green marble cover that led me to pick it up and made a huge, huge difference to my life. 'Cause I'm just that sad. Zang.
Zang.
White on white, just two sun black capes back on the rack. The little goose is dead.